Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined today by two excellent guests. Firstly by the Scottish Government's Minister for Children and Young People, Maree Todd MSP. Maree, how are you this morning?
I'm really good, thank you. Hi.
Excellent. And on the other side of me we have Adam Boys, who is the former Director of the ICMP in Bosnia and now works on the Lebanon Tribunal in The Hague. Adam, how are you today?
Very well, thanks. Very nice to see you.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Now, before we get down to talking about the big stories of the day, we do just have our coronavirus statistics update. So this is as of yesterday afternoon. Obviously, today's figures will be published a couple of hours from now. But as of yesterday, there were 7 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 and another day with 0 new reported deaths. A total of 297,302 people in Scotland have been tested. Of those, 278,962 were confirmed negative. 18,340 tests were positive. There were 323 people in hospital on Friday night, 3 of whom were in intensive care and another 3 in intensive care with suspected COVID-19. And that leaves the total number of deaths so far still standing at 2,490. Again, that is just the people who have tested positive and died in hospital. The total number obviously is slightly larger. And we'll hear more about that in the NRS report on Wednesday. But that is where we stand today. So before we do get into the rest of the news for the day, I will remind you, if you want to join us here on the show, you can do so if you're following us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. You can join the conversation using the hashtag FullScottish, and we will be flashing some of those texts up on the screen throughout the show. So do please get in touch. Let us know your thoughts on some of these big stories. Now, one of the main reasons that we have Adam here with us today is because we are marking this weekend the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica Genocide. We had a special show discussing this on Friday night. Also back in January, we spoke to Hassan Hassanovic, who was a survivor of the genocide, someone who lost most of his family. He now works in remembrance. He works at the genocide centre there in Srebrenica. Adam, if I could come to you first on this. You worked for a long time in Srebrenica, helping to identify the bodies of the nearly 8,000 victims. Tell us a bit about how you're feeling today on the 25th anniversary of the genocide.
Well, Kenny, it's a mixed. I suppose the mixed emotions. Sometimes the overwhelming loss of life is so awe-inspiring that it's hard to take in. I think also the horror of what happened, the terrible efforts to cover up the crimes that happened, and the sort of extensive range of denial is quite disheartening. However, I suppose the work that I was involved in, the organisation that I belong to, the International Commission on Missing Persons, it did something quite unprecedented, which was to recover and find and identify those missing people through a process that forced governments to take account for what happened and for the responsibilities they had for the family. So I suppose mixed with that is a sense of pride in what's happened after the event, with almost 90% of the victims being found and recovered throughout the country.
Maree, your name actually came up during the show. The very Reverend Lorna Hood, who runs Remembering Srebrenica Scotland. She mentioned that you had been someone who had come on a delegation with her and had become a very powerful advocate for the issue back then. How are you feeling today, and what are your thoughts on the anniversary?
So I would say, like Adam, I've got very mixed emotions. I'm absolutely indebted to the charity Remembering Srebrenica Scotland, who took me out as part of a delegation. They regularly take groups of leaders with all sorts of roles, politicians, educators, out to Srebrenica to bear witness to the genocide. You know, as Adam mentioned, there is still an element of denial, which is, you know, really disturbing. So first and foremost, we bear witness, and secondly, to try and learn lessons. And sounds really glib, frankly. I'm a year on from my visit. I'm still processing what I learned about what happened there. It's not easy to learn any easy lessons, although I know, I mean, everybody says it, and it's commonly said because it's absolutely vital that we learn lessons from these episodes in history. But it is devastating to see the impact. It's devastating. I mean, as Minister for Children and Young People, I spoke to adults who were children at the time, and to hear the legacy of the impact of those events is disturbing. You know, simply the hunger. You know, if you think back to Sarajevo, the siege of Sarajevo, people were hungry then, and the impact on your physical development, if you experience hunger at a very early day, is a very early stage of your life, is devastating. So never mind the emotional impact of an ethnic genocide, you know, of a genocide and a war. The simple fact of the level of insecurity and hunger has an impact. So it had a profound effect on me. And yesterday being the 25th anniversary, you know, one of the things I am always struck by is that this had a lifetime in Europe. I'm 47 years old. I was in my late teens, early 20s when this war began. I was living in Trundu, my pre-reg year, when the genocide happened. And I just, you know, the contrast between my life and the people who were living through it now. I watched there's a museum of war childhood in Sarajevo, which is one of the best museums I've ever been to. And they were telling the stories of all the people who had lived through it. And I thought, these people are all younger than me. They were children at the time that it happened. And it is just an incredible insight. And, you know, 25 years in the snap of, you know, blink of an eye, it's gone by. So lots of minutes.
And Adam, on a day like today, what are you looking for as in the future as we kind of still as the whole of Europe still processes that we allowed this to happen? What are you hoping for from the international community and for Bosnia itself in the coming years?
Well, I think the thing that strikes me a lot is this, the oft repeated term, never again. And unfortunately, Srebrenicas are happening all over the world, in Syria, and also for example, we have an estimated 20,000 people have died in the Mediterranean in the last few years, and these are massive losses of life because of a lack of care by authorities, the lack of investigation, and really a lack of international will to do things about these atrocities. And so for Bosnia, I hope that truth will provide a way towards reconciliation. I don't think there is ever a concept of closure for families who've suffered such a tremendous loss. However, I do think that there can be a formal, proper accounting and the use of the rule of law in order to force governments to take account of their actions and to do right by the victims of the surviving victims of these atrocities. It's important to remember that 97% of the victims at Srebrenica were men. And that meant that they left behind women as single heads of household, also as refugees, bringing up, as Maree says, young, extremely traumatized children. And her description of the hunger is extremely important. These were people in a tiny valley, blocked off, completely surrounded, no food. I was driving humanitarian aid trucks at the time. We tried unsuccessfully over a period of 6 months to get to Srebrenica. It was simply impossible, and people had nothing. So that deep trauma has to be taken into account for the country to move on, and also there must be an end to the denial, because the denial is something that is seen as a way of preserving the status quo of the entity structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that's extremely worrying for the future for the country. But ultimately, without international cooperation on all of these issues, on the war in Syria and on in fact, the collapsing Middle East, we can really expect to see this sort of thing happening again and again.
Maree talked there a little bit about the responsibility of the international community. Clearly, one of the things that we talked about in some depth on Friday was the extent to which the international community had failed Bosnia at the time. What's the role of Scotland as we move forward in, first of all, remembering this and, more importantly, preventing it ever happening again?
So I think that's one of the reasons that should drive us. We should all feel a shame about how the international community acted. I mean, I think it is understandable that we are cautious about interfering in countries. In my lifetime, I have seen us appear clumsily in many states as an international community. It needs to be done legally. It needs to be done carefully. It needs to be done sometimes it needs to be done, I suppose, is the conclusion that you come to. But we should all feel a collective shame for what happened in Bosnia. All of that unfolded in full view under the eye of the UN, who, the greatest tragedy, or one of the greatest tragedies of this, is that people flocked to Srebrenica because they thought they would be safe there, because the UN them in that place, and the fact that they came to harm under the direct eye of the UN is to our collective shame, and that undoubtedly is one of the toughest lessons to learn. There are lots of lessons we need to learn if we genuinely are to mean never again, and that is one of the toughest ones that we have to learn. There's a lot of anger against the individual soldiers and the fact that they were Dutch, and the Dutch government have apologised, but it was a collective endeavour. The UN is a collective endeavour, and we should have collective responsibility for that.
And once again, if you are interested in learning a wee bit more about this subject, we did have that special episode of Scotland at 7 on Friday. And we also, back on Holocaust Memorial Day, we spoke to a survivor of the Holocaust from the Nazi era, as well as Hasan Hasanovic, a survivor of the Srebrenica Genocide. Two really fascinating shows if you are interested in learning a bit more. So we move on now, though, to discussing Brexit, which, it's the story that never goes away. But Maree, we know now there is going to be no extension. That opportunity passed us at the end of June. But this week we've heard more and more talk about no deal. Angela Merkel was warning the EU that they need to start preparing quite seriously for no deal this week. How close do you think we are to a no deal outcome from this negotiation?
I think it's perfectly possible, frankly. I mean, I don't think there is any come from us leaving the EU. Scotland didn't vote for it. You know, cards on the table. I would rather we weren't doing it. I think it is clear. I mean, in the midst of a pandemic, how the government, the UK government, can be continuing to pursue Brexit. I don't. You know, I find it incomprehensible that that's where their focus lies, and I think it is more likely than ever that we face a no deal, and I am, you know, frankly very concerned about the impact that might have, particularly at this moment in time. So I think of, you know, here I am in the Highlands, an area which is going to be incredibly hard hit economically by the COVID pandemic, the impact on tourism, the impact on exporting our fish and, you know, much of our produce. And then I think of the impact on Brexit. We are also likely to suffer a great deal of harm from whatever Brexit we face. And the idea of a deal Brexit and a, you know, frankly, a double whammy at the moment just fills me with dread. There are also health concerns. You know, you'll know by trade I'm a pharmacist, and I worked for 20 years as a pharmacist. And the idea of disrupt further the flow of pharmaceuticals with a no-deal Brexit in the middle of a global pandemic where systems are stretched to the ready is just reckless in the extreme, I would say.
We're going to discuss the pharmaceutical issue a wee bit more shortly, but Adam, coming to you now, when you see the UK kind of pulling out of the world in a number of ways, and this kind of step back from international cooperation, at the same time as we see the US doing similar things, how much do you think that impacts the way the international community behaves, you know, in all these other crises that we have to deal with in the Middle East, dealing with refugee crisis in the Mediterranean? How does Britain's withdrawal from the EU affect those kind of issues?
Well, it's tremendous. I mean, it's I think that tremendous in the worst sense. Brexit is exactly the reason that you never ever should put peace agreements to the vote. This was you know, the European negotiations would brought us out of a terrible world war, catastrophic. It was imperfect. Peace agreements are always imperfect. And you build on them. You don't put them to the vote because there's always far too much emotion around these things. And I live in the Netherlands now, and the Dutch press, the Dutch people, are very good friends of the United Kingdom. And they watch this disaster as if they were worried relatives. They are looking on this process and wondering whether we have gone mad. And frankly, I completely agree with Maree. To be pursuing this during a terrible pandemic like this is just extraordinary. The level of I don't know what sort of jingoism is forcing this process forward, but it's going to leave us in an economically poorer situation. That will lead to all sorts of social problems, but it also lead to a very unpleasant form of jingoism, which I fear. And when you talk about the international cooperation, Britain as a whole punched above its weight, always did since the Second World War. And now we are, the United Kingdom is a sort of joke on the international stage at this time. And I fear that things like the dismantlement of the DFID, a very, very important institution, is an extremely bad signal if we're going to start pushing a much more political agenda when it comes to aid and trade.
Also seen the announcement that new customs facilities are to be built in Kent. Is the 5 months that we have left, is that going to be long enough for a major infrastructure project run by the British government?
I mean, who knows? Let's see how they go. I mean, it was very interesting to see how, you know, that those headlines were framed actually by the press as if it was a great thing that there was an infrastructure investment. You know, that alone, I actually sometimes have to pinch myself to think that is this where we are? I don't know if 5 months is enough. They certainly do, you know, the UK government do not fill me with confidence, but that's probably no surprise to anyone. I haven't seen their record of managing infrastructure projects as a shining one, but I heard Micheál Martin on Andrew Marr this morning, and I do think there is ultimately an immense responsibility on the shoulders of all political leaders at the moment to ensure that they come to an agreement that does not harm their people. So Micheál Martin, the new Taoiseach of Ireland, was saying very clearly, you know, he wants to pursue an agreement which means that his people won't be harmed. Europe want to pursue an agreement that means that their people won't be harmed, and our government must pursue an agenda that means that our people won't be harmed. And I think, you know, the decision has been made. We are leaving, and we need to do that in an orderly fashion, which does not harm the population of the UK.
No, Adam. What is the reaction? You mentioned the press reaction there. Do you get the sense from Dutch political leaders and from the people of the Netherlands themselves that it's worth pursuing a good deal with the UK, or is there a sense that maybe the EU should just cut us loose and stop worrying about trying to pacify us?
I think that Prime Minister Rutte is one of the most enlightened leaders on the European continent, and he has, once they recognised that Brexit would happen, they've just taken very practical measures. They've increased the number of customs officers. They've given advisory notices to Dutch companies. They absolutely see themselves as being a trading partner to the UK. It's certainly not what they want, but they're pragmatic trading folk, and they do see that this must happen, and so they've done a lot more planning than I sense the UK government has done, frankly.
Well, we did also hear this week that the UK government has decided to opt out of the EU's COVID vaccine scheme. This is a scheme to basically bulk buy the vaccine supplies to supply the EU. The UK felt that it couldn't participate because it wasn't going to be part of the decision-making process, which obviously is a natural consequence of us having left the EU. Maree, this is obviously a wee bit down your alley as a pharmacist. What do you make of the UK's refusal to participate in this? And, you know, I guess in the same breath, you could probably talk about the UK's refusal to participate in EU PPE procurement earlier in the pandemic.
So I have to say, I think at the root of this decision is politics, which is devastating, really. The reason that they won't participate in the EU procurement is because it has the words EU in it. The reason that they are pursuing the solo route is British exceptionalism. I heard Matt Hancock talk about it, and he said, "Oh, you know, we don't want to work with the EU on it because we're ahead." We're ahead. And I just thought, gosh, I think we have 2 vaccines under development in the UK. Worldwide, there's well over 100, if not 100 vaccines under development. We're probably, my understanding of pharmaceutical drug development is, a small handful of those will come to the fore. I think the Oxford vaccine is undergoing phase 3 trials, so it's pretty far on. That doesn't mean that it's going to A, be effective and B, get to market. It is incredible to hear that level of ignorance. And, when I think back and compare, one of the great losses we had from leaving the EU is coming out of their Medicines Regulation Authority. So I don't, it's not my area of expertise now. I'm a politician now, but we left the European regulate. Well, actually they left us. Their offices were in London, and all of that expertise have left London and gone to mainland Europe. The way that pharmaceutical markets work is not even slightly altruistic. There is no loyalty or altruism in it. It is market driven purely, and the biggest markets in the world are the US and Europe. Australia found itself with its own regulatory system and its own small market, and it would be 6 months to a year behind the rest of the world in gaining access to new drugs, which meant that people with say secondary breast cancer in Australia would have to buy their own drugs and import them, go through the rigmarole of importing them in order to access new drugs to treat that condition. Now, the idea of coming, that somehow the pharmaceutical markets will work for a very small country, 60 million people, on the edge of a huge market, and in order to gain a license, they'll have to go through a different regulatory system. I mean, pharmaceutical companies will go for the big markets first and go through their regulatory process. So unless our regulatory process is very aligned with either the US or the EU, there is inevitably going to be a delay, because it's just not going to make economic sense for a pharmaceutical company to come here first.
And also this week, Maree, we've seen the COVID recovery measures announced in the Chancellor's statement. How do you think that's going to play in Scotland now that we've had a bit of more time to dig into it and see what's in there?
So firstly, many of the measures are very welcome. Throughout this crisis, we needed a coronavirus job retention scheme. We needed that for public health. We needed people to be able to afford to stay away from their work. We needed people to be able to maintain their link with the employment market. So, many of the measures that the UK government have introduced have been very welcome. What we saw this week was which frankly was underwhelming. If I talk to, and I do have some Tory pals, they were, the size of it is underwhelming, to say the least. It bypasses the Scottish Government, which the Tories seem to think is an advantage. So it's direct investment from the UK into Scotland. But most people in Scotland believe that the Scottish Government is the best government to make these decisions. So I don't think it will gain them the kudos that they are hoping for. And there are some real gaping challenges, so the tourism sector, we really need, in the Highlands and Islands, we really need that coronavirus job retention scheme to continue to see us through the winter, to have the market begin with reduced capacity many months into the season is not going to be enough to see us through to next year. That is difficult. It is as ever as well, the devil is in the detail. So of all of the money that was announced this week, very little of it was new. Much of it was stuff that had been promised. Some of the infrastructure investment turned out to be payment for PPE. So behind the headlines, it is underwhelming in the extreme, and you'll hear you clearly have a certain political slant, you will hear many independent commentators say the same thing. And it came with a dose of, British nationalism at the very beginning. The idea that somehow we're thankful to this benevolent government for spending our tax money in a way that countries around the world are doing is frankly ridiculous. And to bring politics into the midst of an emergency, most people have put politics on hold while we deal with the immediacy of the health threat and the economic threat. But no, not the Tories.
Adam, coming to you now again. You're obviously seeing this from a bit more of an outsider perspective. How does Britain's or the UK's response to the coronavirus crisis look from the other side of the water?
It looks terrible. I mean, it's the measures, the stream of measures that came out at the beginning. I think the people were definitely everybody was wondering about how to react. The shutdown started in Europe before they did in the UK. And then I think everybody was pretty much on the same page. And there was some, I think, very positive responses to Rishi Sunak's initial measures, which were genuinely quite impressive. But since then, I think, especially since the Dominic Cummings affair, it's just seen as being a joke. And we have a sort of almost like a comedy show going on, which is just appalling. But the numbers are catastrophic compared to the rest of Europe, where really they have managed to control the spread of the virus, and they're not talking in these sort of very grand statements about opening up for business and go out and go to the pubs and things like this. It's very, very measured, controlled messages, and a lot of effort being put into things like contact tracing and all the things that we seem to have had mixed messages on in the past in the UK. So it's not. The numbers alone just look catastrophic compared to, with the exception perhaps of Belgium and Sweden. We just don't look at all good.
How has the response been for you in the Netherlands? Do you feel that the government there has done a good job? Have they? Do you feel that you're getting things under control there now?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually, because they called it an intelligent lockdown, and I almost don't really understand how they managed to do it, because the rules were 1.5 meters. They closed a lot of businesses and shops, but nothing completely. And there was a period, and then what happened was, when they started to see that the curve was going on a downslope, they issued very clear instructions in a sort of graphic representation that took us through all the way to the 1st of September. Amusingly, typically Netherlands, in the graphic, which is a very simple one, the 1st of September is when the cannabis coffee shops and sex workers can start operating again. So that was obviously a great relief to a lot of the population. But it was very clearly done. There's a lot of public information, but very few changes. So you don't get reverses. It does seem to be quite well planned out. I think one of the things that was important was that they chose a distance of 1.5 meters. I don't know why. I think these things are seem to be based on old measures, but that's been effective. I think there was one person died yesterday. It's a very, very the number of cases per day is very, very low here.
And when you're hearing about the UK in the media there, is there a distinction made between what's happening in England and what's happening in the other three parts of the UK?
Yes, well, that's very clear. I have to say that there was I don't speak Dutch, so I can't say that I've watched the television, but a lot of people have told me there's a very clear difference between the sort of clear, straightforward messaging coming out of the Scottish government versus the Westminster briefings. And there's a great deal of admiration. I don't think people necessarily had quite regardless of their political bent, I think that people have really respected Nicola Sturgeon's approach to this. Very clear messages, very straightforward, a lot of engagement, no humour at these press conferences, and straightforward messaging, which I think was extremely important. So yes, I think there's definitely a clear difference between the way it's seen. But of course, the overwhelming numbers in the UK just sort of obliterate any kind of subtlety of messaging in that sense.
Maree, to come back to you, this week, as partly obviously as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, you've had to announce the delay to the rollout of more childcare for Scotland's young people, Scotland's youngest people. So could you tell us, first of all, a wee bit, how did this decision come about?
So in actual fact, it has been a wee while coming. Quite early on in the pandemic, we made the very difficult decision to change the legislation. So there was coming into force in August this year was a statutory requirement for localities to provide 1140 hours of childcare to all 3 and 4 year olds and many eligible 2-year-olds. And it became very clear very early on in the pandemic that we could not have that universal legal requirement in place in August. So we paused that. In terms of when we can reinstate it, that's what the week's letter was about. What we were saying was giving local authorities certainty, and frankly, everybody is still committed to this. Everybody is still absolutely passionate about it. We know how transformative it will be, and we also are very aware of the current economic circumstances we face. It is more important than ever. Childcare is vitally important to enable largely women to work and to support families. So we know it's more important than ever, but there has undoubtedly been an impact from the pandemic. And I think it's inevitable that just next month we can't deliver it. And we will regroup and see how soon we can deliver it. Local authorities have been given flexibility to use the 1140 money, which of course they already have as part of the settlement, in emergency response. So some of the money has been used for emergency key worker childcare provision. There has also been an inevitable pause in construction. There's been no construction for 3 months, and there's been an inevitable pause on it, but pretty quickly we'll be able to get back to it. And we will regroup in December and come out with a clear plan as to when we feel we can deliver the universal entitlement. Of course, some local authorities are committing already to deliver. So North Lanarkshire said that they will deliver 1140 hours in September this year, and that's really welcome. There are other local authorities who have been very clear about delivering more than the minimum 600 hours and have said that they will relook at it in January to see whether they can deliver more. I think Aberdeenshire falls into that category. So at the moment, inevitably local authorities are they're on the front line in this emergency, and they are dealing with all of the public health measures and all of the educational impacts that have been. As soon as we're past this critical crisis stage, we will be right back on 1140 hours.
Going to be able to achieve this. So is this a case that they were just further ahead in their preparations, or was this a situation where they've perhaps had less money they've needed to spend in managing the pandemic and have therefore money left over that they can still afford the childcare?
So I think it's political in North Lanarkshire, and many of the decisions they make are very focused on delivering for children. They recognise the impact that this commitment can have on, we're very focused on the economic impacts and supporting families and enabling them to work at the moment. But at the heart of 1140 hours is quality, and high quality early learning and childcare transforms lives. It is one of the best investments that you can make. It closes the attainment gap. It enables children to arrive at school without that, without any intervention. What happens is that children from the poorest backgrounds arrive at school sometimes up to 18 months behind their peers. And with the intervention of high quality early learning and childcare, you can level that playing field and close that gap before it ever occurs. So for many reasons, many local authorities, all local authorities are completely committed to this. North Lanarkshire were able to it, and all local authorities will be looking. I think Argyll and Bute, there are a handful that have already said that they are able to deliver. Some of that is about having been further ahead, and some of that is political decision making of the councils themselves.
This gap that exists for some kids now, obviously there are a whole lot of kids across the whole country now who have had a long chunk of time without any school at all. Are there any plans in place to help those kids catch up? I know a number of teachers who were quite looking forward to a more phased return to education precisely because they'd have time to focus on some of the kids that needed the most help to catch up. Are there plans in place to help those kids make up the difference?
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right that almost all educators are eager to get on with that task because they recognise that the impact of, education has continued, so let's be clear about that. The teachers have still been teaching throughout this pandemic, but education in school, face-to-face, is needed, and some children need that more than others, and they are very eager to get on with that task. In terms of restoring and recovering, I think that as well as, we've heard our counterparts in the UK government talk about extra tuition, and, I slightly disagree when I hear that. I think that children need, as we do, to heal from the trauma of this experience. They need to feel secure and healthy and confident in order to be able to learn. There are many ways to do that and to build up children's resilience. So as well as, a conventional educational catch-up, I think it would be great if we can get, we're very keen to get youth work involved. We're very keen to work with partners who are specialists in outdoor education, because magical things can happen for children when they have the experience of outdoor learning. We have an arts community who are poised to do really creative, child-centred interventions. If you think about the Systema project in Stirling and the work that they have done with some of the most deprived communities, we have sports authorities really eager to help. So there will be, I have absolutely no doubt, a collective and national effort to help children to recover from the experience that they've had, with a particular focus on supporting those who need it most.
I'm sure look forward to hearing more about that. But we move on now to talk a little bit about what's happening across the Atlantic, where President Donald Trump has just commuted Roger Stone's sentence. Roger Stone, of course, was a key Trump aide who had been convicted for obstruction of justice, amongst other things. And Robert Mueller, who conducted the probe into the Trump campaign's alleged links to Russia, has spoken out today condemning this decision by Donald Trump. Adam, coming to you on this, what's been your reaction to this continued attempts by the Trump campaign to absolve themselves of any guilt, any responsibility for just about anything that they do?
I'm always a bit wary of talking about other people's governments, but one thing I would say is that I think that if you want to maintain the trust of the people generally, you really do have to follow the laws that you're meant to be upholding. And I think that anything like this, it may play well to Donald Trump's more rabid sort of base, but I think really the sort of the older style Republicans are not going to like seeing this sort of thing. Law, he talks about law and order, and then does something like this, which I believe even William Barr has advised him against. I think that's the sort of thing that really does undermine credibility even more. So that's really. I'm not an expert on the American system, but it's quite clear that these sorts of things really do, I think, lead more and more people to wonder whether he's behaving in an entirely democratic manner. So yeah.
Famously has a tattoo of Richard Nixon on his back, and now, much like Nixon, he's been pardoned very shortly after his crimes by a president who obviously has owes him something. So, Maree, when you look at these kinds of things, Trump's poll numbers are not doing as well as he hoped. At this stage in the election cycle. Obviously, the election is due to happen in November, and he seems to be struggling in a lot of battleground states. On top of his response to the COVID crisis, which clearly hasn't helped him, do you think this kind of thing is going to help him win the trust of the American people?
I mean, I find that very hard to believe. I am no expert in American politics, and like the rest of the world, I look on with dismay at with dismay and puzzlement actually as to how things have landed this way. Trump, just this week, I think there was an amazing political broadcast brought out by some of the Republicans against Trump, which used words and some quite vivid imagery to completely dismantle Trump's campaign. I think it is. I would be very pleased to see him lose the election, but it's for people in America to decide who their leader is and to operate in the system over there. One thing which does regularly fascinate me about Trump, if I can be a little bit personal at the moment, is Trump's mum is from Lewis and my mum is from Lewis, and one of the so he's as distant from the island of Lewis as I am, literally. His mother is from there. And one of the most striking things about island life when you visit any island is that people are very empathetic. Life in an island is very connected. Survival can't be about an individual experience. You're very reliant on your neighbours and you're very tuned into them, and you see that expressed through empathy, but also through superstition and religion and a belief in signs. And then when I look at Trump, I am absolutely astonished to see someone who is, as I say, as far from the islands as I am. Literally, his mum, his cousins still live there, and appears to have zero empathy, and as well as that, has entirely shed his Scottish Protestant dislike of bling and pomp and decoration. In fact, is the very opposite, very polar opposite of what we would usually think of as key characteristics of somebody from Lewis. So I just thought I would send there as a very personal angle. I watch him with interest. I read this morning a fascinating interview with Dr. Fauci, who has a the very unenviable job of advising Trump during this pandemic, and revealed in that interview he hasn't briefed him directly for 2 months. Astonishing.
Kenny, there's just one thing, just on that point that Maree made about the pandemic. I think one of the problems, if you look at the United numbers, they treat it as if it is, if you like, the statistics are given on the basis as they would be if it was a European country. But America's so big, and what we're seeing is a sort of there's an exaggeration of the statistics, and what we are right at the beginning of are terrible numbers, a really terrible wave in Florida and Texas and some of these southern states which have previously not had the same level. So they're at the start not of a second wave but of a first wave. And I think that I looked today at the projections. They're talking of, by the 1st of November, which is the date just before the election, numbers of around 208,000 people will have died by that date. And these are quite conservative projections. So I think that's really going to be quite telling for Mr. Trump in his campaign, I think.
To our last story of today, and this was the announcement that aid is going to be getting into Syria for the first time in quite some time, going into the Idlib region. This was an agreement by the UN Security Council to enable one way in to Syria for aid workers. And it comes amidst this discussion that's been going on about the aid policy of the UK. DFID is to be folded into the Foreign Office. To some considerable outrage and upset amongst the aid community and amongst some of the UK's politicians. Maree, how do you feel about this feeling of the UK changing its relationship with the rest of the world in such a drastic way?
So firstly, I agree. I think that is an absolutely terrible decision, and I hope they will reconsider it. In terms of the relationship that the UK has with the rest of the, I mean, we're all, even within the UK, looking on with alarm at the insularity of approach, if we go back to the very original conversation that we were having, which was about Srebrenica and about the situation in Bosnia, the UK played a very strong and important role in negotiating peace and maintaining it, and it still has a powerful influence. But when I visited last year in June, it was very clear that the UK's influence is falling around the world, and whilst we may have concerns about how the UK uses influence, it has, in many parts of the world, been regarded as an important influence and an influence for good. And the fact that it is losing its international status, it's becoming very insular and very small looking, and has a great deal less power, is a sadness to me as a person here, and who is keen that we use our power and influence not just for ourselves. I'm an absolute internationalist. We don't just want to make life better for ourselves. We do want our country to be a force for good in the world. So, we want the UK to be a force for good in the world. I definitely want Scotland to be a force for good in the world, and to lose that, to cast away and, throw away that power and influence for, we're not entirely sure what we gain, either as individuals. We certainly lose, and it's we've done it lightly, and these things are very, very hard to recover, I would say. So, I find myself despairing. I think that there are so many challenging issues in the world today, and particularly the most pressing of them all, this virus, this global pandemic, which every country around the world is dealing with. And it feels like the UK is fiddling while Rome burns.
And Adam, obviously you work in the international human rights arena. When you see the UK changing the way it proposes to deliver aid in this way, at the same time seeing, for example, arms sales resume to Saudi Arabia on the basis that human rights abuses have only been isolated incidents, how does it make you feel to see the UK again, this kind of withdrawal from previous norms of international behaviour?
I think it's extremely sad. One thing I would say is that DFID itself is an extremely well-run organisation. It has fantastic controls over the way it spends money. Of course, there are going to be a few incidents where money goes missing, but that's partly based on the fact that the budget is so massive and the reach is so great. But it is a model for the way that funding should be dispensed around the world. It's got a very dedicated staff. In all my experience in all the countries that I've worked in, DFID and the Foreign Office have always been in a partnership in any case. The DFID would not do something that was against British foreign policy. They are very closely aligned. I fear that, for example, if Maree was talking about the effects on children of the COVID pandemic, there are very important elements of both development aid and human rights work that are supported by DFID, by the UK, in places like Iraq, or with children in refugee camps in Turkey and around the world. Now, if those will focus on things like better social integration, dealing with the effects of severe trauma. Now that doesn't help trade, but it's incredibly important. And so I fear that if we turn our aid into some sort of sort of sales platform for the UK economy, then we will forget those incredibly important and fundamental matters, which ultimately will prevent conflict in other parts of the world. We seem to be at the point where we want to just create walls, whereas if we want to stop the flow of people coming across borders, we do need to invest in the countries themselves to stop the tap, stop the reason for these mass migrations. And I think that I feel very concerned that we're just turning it into a sort of a sales platform, which I don't agree with at all.
Well, obviously we will continue to keep an eye on that, but unfortunately we are just about out of time. I'm sure we could talk about all of these issues for a lot longer, and I hope that we can have Adam and Maree back sometime soon to do just that. So thank you to both of them for joining us. Thank you to you at home for joining us as well. The whole point of having these shows is to have an audience for them, so you're the most important part of the equation here. If you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, we would ask you please, if you can, to go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up there as a supporter. Your £5 a month can make a huge difference to everything that we do here at Broadcasting Scotland. We need a budget, first of all, just to keep the lights on, to keep our internet connection working. But then we have a whole lot of ideas, possibly somewhat delayed by the pandemic, but we do want to develop the number, the type, and the quality of all the shows that we produce. So do please support us if you can. If you can't, we do understand. We know how difficult the pandemic has been for a lot of people on their pockets. But don't worry, the shows will always be free to view online. You can still do something important though. Please follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot and find us on Facebook as well. And then share the shows around. Be our marketing team. Let people know why you watch Broadcasting Scotland and why other people should support us in the same way. And finally, as I said, we are planning lots of things as we come out of the pandemic. We're able to have a few more people in the studio. We have a lot of ideas, but those are all going to rely on having some more people here to help us make them happen. So if you're interested in getting involved in any way with TV production, whether in front of or behind the camera, then do please get in touch with us. We have lots of things for you to do here. But that is absolutely all we have time for. So once again, thank you very much to Maree Todd MSP and Adam Boys. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. I'll be back at my usual slot on Tuesday night. But until then, have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you.